NASCAR star Kyle Larson has lost his ride at Chip Ganassi Racing in the NASCAR Cup Series following a racial slur said by the driver during an iRacing NASCAR event. The team had this release today, and I have to tell you, this is not shocking in the least bit. I think this was the only choice that Chip Ganassi had given this situation. But I'm going to address the elephant in the room right away. A lot of people are making this a freedom of speech issue. And in my opinion, it is not. Kyle Larson is, as far as I'm aware, still completely allowed to drop the N-bomb whenever he wants. No one is going to come to his house. Police aren't going to come to his house and throw him in jail for that. But he was under contract with a private corporation, Chip Ganassi Racing. He said the N-word, offended the sponsors, offended fans, and Chip Ganassi made the choice that was best for business. It was either keep his sponsors or keep Kyle Larson. And ultimately, Kyle Larson was expendable in this situation. And, you know, I think it's not a very good look if you are going very hard on this being a violation of First Amendment rights, when at this very moment, many of your First Amendment rights have been suspended, or at least many of your constitutional rights, because of this pandemic. If you have some major righteous feeling that you need to direct a lot of patriotic energy to defending our rights and freedoms, perhaps read up, get informed, and make sure that many of the personal liberties and freedoms that we have lost during this pandemic come back after the pandemic, rather than defending a driver who was fired from a private corporation for dropping an N-bomb during a video game. Deal? Okay. I do want to commend Chip Ganassi Racing and NASCAR. I think they handled this situation as best as they could. They were given a bleep sandwich and made the best of it. Particularly, I mean, obviously NASCAR suspended him immediately and is sending him to sensibility training, and who knows when the hell they're going to actually bring him back, if ever. Chip Ganassi Racing, I think they did a really, I got to commend their PR team. I think they did a really solid job of minimizing the damage to their personal brand. They didn't go out immediately and fire Kyle Larson, which I think would have turned a lot more people off. They waited for the sponsors to make the decision. Ultimately, the sponsors first, I mean, they obviously disavowed, which is another good thing. They came out and disavowed the statement, but didn't fire him. Then the sponsors disavowed, and then you started seeing the sponsors going away. Credit One, iRacing, Lucas Oil, Chevrolet, and McDonald's did eventually release a statement and said they would no longer work with Kyle Larson. And when you're put in a situation like that, when you're Chip Ganassi Racing, I think the only choice was to fire. And again, I think they did it in about the best way they could have given the situation. Again, I think Chip Ganassi Racing was very solid here, handled it as well as you could. Now, not all the sponsors ended up leaving Kyle Larson, and that's kind of where we're going to go here, or from here anyway. So a couple of sponsors that put out public statements that said they would not be leaving Kyle Larson were Finley Farms and Plan B Sales. Now, these are smaller private businesses. They're small businesses, I guess they would be classified at. Obviously, one is a farming company. The other one is a die-cast dealer. And the key here is that they are primarily sponsors of Kyle Larson on his dirt racing. And that's kind of going to be one of the big things we're talking about in this video is what is happening in the future? Where do all these parties end up going from here? And the Kyle Larson one, obviously, we're going to talk about first because it's the most interesting. Now, the man has a long road ahead. I know some people were upset that I said cancel culture yesterday, and that was, it's definitely a hot take, but I think at the same time you look at it and he's definitely been canceled. Now, cancel culture, believe it or not, isn't always a bad thing. I mean, just say the word Harvey Weinstein or the name Harvey Weinstein, and I think you'll agree there. And I think this is, I hate to say it, but it's justified. And I guess I really shouldn't hate to say it, because it is terrible that he used the N-word in that context. I mean, you can't, again, like I said yesterday, you can't even use the context argument because the guy didn't know he was being recorded. He said it like he was saying the name of his dog. That was how comfortable he seemed with that word. So, yeah, I mean, he's canceled right now. And I don't know if he can come back from this. Will he have the money to go dirt racing? I think he will. I mean, nobody in the dirt world seems to have canceled him. For make of that what you will, I suppose. But that seems like where he will go. And I think a lot of people, have said, well, Kyle Larson was always headed for dirt. And I say, yeah, probably not this way, though. I always felt like Kyle Larson was trying to make his fortune in NASCAR and then go dirt racing kind of in the second half of his career full time. I'm guessing he probably didn't financially plan to start dirt racing this early. Now, I think a lot of people are wondering, will he come back to NASCAR? And I think you have a couple of examples. Again, the most obvious parallel, obviously, is Jeremy Clements, who said the N-word in an interview with MTV, was exposed for that, was suspended indefinitely, and unfortunately that indefinite suspension only lasted about 2 races, and then he was brought back. But, Jeremy Clements still has a career. He won a race at Road America, and he's still racing to this day in NASCAR. Now, the key difference there is that Jeremy Clements owns his own team. Kyle Larson is almost certainly going to have to be hired once again. And then you start looking at cases like Kurt Busch, where he was suspended for alleged domestic violence against his wife. It turned out that he was more or less the abused one in that relationship at the end of the day, and those things were dropped. But that did hurt his career. He had to go to James Finch Racing. Obviously, he did have some personal issues as well with anger, but he raced for Finch for a while, then went to Stewart Haas Racing. And eventually, he's landed at Ganassi of all places. The other one I was kind of thinking of was AJ Allmendinger, who had a drug problem. I think he was tested positive for Adderall. Obviously, not a very hard drug, but it violated the policy. He was fired from Team Penske, only to get rehired to run the Indianapolis 500 and a couple of IndyCar races before ending back up in NASCAR again for James Finch, and then ultimately going on to JTG Daugherty Racing, and obviously eventually getting hired by NBC as a color commentator. Now again, saying the N-word and getting a positive drug test, those are way different ends of the spectrum, just from a societal standpoint. And so to expect or to think that Kyle Larson is going to be back in Cup anytime soon, I think is very, very pie in the sky thinking. I just don't see it. And this is where the things are going to get really touch and go, because obviously he's lost some big sponsors that were also on the dirt side, Lucas Oil, iRacing, Chevrolet. How is he going to be able to continue racing as a full-time living without as much of the corporate backing as he had before? That's going to be the big problem. Now let's talk about a couple of other entities that are affected by this, namely the NASCAR teams and also the eNASCAR side of things, because I think there's changes coming for all parties involved. Obviously, Chip Ganassi Racing is the other major party affected by this. And like I said, I think they've come out of this about as best as they could. It doesn't appear that they lost any of their sponsors. The sponsors clearly said it's us or him, and he picked the sponsors. Therefore, he's probably going to have a lot of leeway choosing his next driver. And I think suddenly you look at Ross Chastain, who was screwed by a bad business deal with DC Solar. He is now in the position where he's not only negotiating with Chip Ganassi Racing, but let's keep in mind, currently he's the driver of the number 6 car for Roush Fenway Racing, who of course he's replacing Ryan Newman. But again, with the injuries that Ryan Newman sustained, particularly to his head, we don't know when he will come back, if he will come back. There have been some drivers that have just not come back from head injuries. Dario Franchitti is one of the ones I think about. So we just don't know with Ryan Newman. So there's a potential that there's a bidding war going on right now for the services of Ross Chastain. And it's great for him. And I do think eventually he will land at Ganassi, because I think Ganassi will outbid Roush if it comes down to that. If again, Ryan Newman cannot make it, I think Roush will eventually have to go with a different driver, assuming Newman can't come back. And I think it's a great opportunity for Ross Chastain. I think he showed really well in Ganassi equipment in the Daytona 500, and obviously in the Xfinity Series when he ran for them. I think he, again, I've said this on the channel the whole time, is that the man knows what he's doing behind the wheel of a stock car, and I think it'll be very exciting to see him once everything comes back take over that ride and hopefully have a lot of success. I think the other team that is affected by this is Hendrick Motorsports, because I think one of the drivers they would have been looking at to take the Jimmy Johnson seat, the 48 car, was Kyle Larson. Well, it doesn't look like that is going to happen unless Rick Hendrick is really interested in a redemption arc, which I don't think he is. I think the lead candidate for that seat is now undoubtedly Brad Keselowski, who does not appear to be particularly happy at Team Penske, and it appears almost like Roger is beginning to favor Ryan Blaney over him anyway. And, you don't know when Austin Cindric or somebody else is going to move up into the Cup Series and take over the third seat at Team Penske. It's probably going to be sooner rather than later. Now, the other thing to think about with Hendrick is, with this pandemic, what's going to happen with Jimmy Johnson's seat? Is he going to come back for the 2021 season, depending on how many races we lose in 2020? Or is he done regardless of whether a season happens or not? I have no idea. The final thing I want to talk about, because again, there seemed to be some confusion about this, and I want to clarify it a little bit, because a lot of people were saying, oh, it's a false equivalency to say the Bubba Wallace thing and the Kyle Larson thing are completely unrelated. And while I would completely agree with you that a driver being fired for a rage quit and another driver being fired for dropping an N-bomb, those are completely different situations. And one was handled, I think, very well by all parties involved, and the other one was not handled very well by all parties involved. I think the common denominator is that the sponsors are looking at this whole new NASCAR deal and the driver streams, where you're hearing literally everything said in real time, no 7-second delay, no nothing. They're looking at this, and we now have 2 consecutive weeks where sponsors have looked bad for one reason or another due to actions of the drivers on these streams. And you'd be foolish to think that they are not looking at that and seeing a pattern become established. God forbid something happens this week where another driver, whether it's closer to the Bubba Wallace side of the spectrum or whether it's closer to the Kyle Larson side of the spectrum, happens, and we have another driver facing real-world consequences for something that happens during a video game race. I think those are bad optics, and I think many sponsors are starting to get nervous about this sort of thing, and we're just going to have to see what changes over the next couple of weeks. Like I said in the last video, IndyCar has already taken measures to make sure the drivers aren't being heard all the time. They closed the driver channel a couple times during the Michigan race just to make sure the drivers weren't able to yell at each other and swear at each other because, again, I think in the words of race control, they're just there to put on a show and represent their sponsors. And I think sponsors, look, I don't think it could get much worse than Kyle Larson. I'm not suggesting that it's going to happen again. I mean, I think many people are right in saying, well, just don't be racist. And I think, yeah, of course, that's the solution at the end of the day here. But sponsors aren't going to look at that rationally. They're going to look at the result of outrage culture, whether it's justified or not. And we've seen it unjustified with Bubba Wallace and justified with Kyle Larson, and what impact and what damage that has had on the brands associated with the folks who had, rightly or wrongly, this outrage culture go against them. So again, I just worry that much of this access that we have had recently will go away because, again, I kind of look at it, you can listen to me or you cannot listen to me, but I look at this internet drama from a different perspective than many other people. Again, this is my job. I see this happen all the time. I see people get demonetized for things that happen to them on the internet for very stupid reasons. And generally speaking, on the internet, advertisers are very skittish. If something happens, even if it's one bad apple and none of the other people in the bunch are going to cause any trouble, they punish everybody. They take away or they restrict things, they take away advertisements, they do all of this stuff. I predict that that will happen in this situation almost 100%. Again, it's a situation that a lot of advertisers don't understand. They get fearful when they have situations like this happen, and they just start thinking a worst case scenario. What if this happens to us? So I would expect changes coming to the NASCAR stuff and some of the driver streams. I'm just telling you, that's probably coming. So let me know what you think of all this. Again, I think it was the right choice for Ganassi Racing to fire Kyle Larson over this. I think they handled it very well. Again, I hope, the important thing to me is that Kyle Larson truly not only regrets what he says, but hopefully makes amends to, make it better. And I don't know how someone recovers from this, but I hope he finds a way, because I do believe that people do ultimately deserve a second chance if they so want it. Thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube. I'll see you in the next video.